A less good starting point is the notion that the standard definition of design, which has been handed down, is that design is a problem-solving exercise. And what I'm going to talk about is why that may not be, but then to use some spatial examples. So let's take a classic design problem. Here is a problem, yeah? And how do I, as a designer, solve this problem? It's really easy. Here I am. I do this. Problem solved. But let's now look at what is called the Obesity System Map. Let's look at, actually, that solution is clearly completely banal. Because obesity, if you look at this map, and you can't see it on the screen, so I will zoom in a bit, but you still can hardly see it. It's worth Googling it. It's an amazing piece of work, which actually looks at the social, the cultural, the political, the environmental, the medical, all of the various aspects of how obesity is caused. And at the same time, you might then see your problem, i.e. your question that you've been asked, is, as I saw the two presentations, is multifaceted. It's easy to take a direct line through it and say there is only one thing. But at every single level, there will be competing forces which you also need to be aware of. I would say the question, because that's my nature, I would say the question you've been asked is deeply political. Deeply political. Particularly, so by the way, I am political. I say that at the start, so you can't accuse me of being biased. If I state that I'm political, then that's an honest thing to say. Yeah? If I state that I'm a feminist rather than a misogynist, then you have to take on the board that I'm a feminist and not a misogynist. So if I state I am political and of the left. So in the age of the NHS, which is, depending on what happens on Saturday, but if we go for no deal, the NHS will almost certainly be subsumed by American corporate interests. How then does your question fit into the subsuming of the NHS within American corporate interests? So all I'm really saying is that anything that may look simple is actually is a set of very, very complex interrelationships. And therefore, part of what you need to do in any exercise, either as a designer or as what you're doing in terms of looking at it from slightly different perspective, of a kind of business-oriented perspective, is to understand those complexities and then to make sense of them. You will not be able to solve them. No one intervention is going to solve your problem. Because, as I'll talk about, problems are a very particular thing. If then I look at another thing, which actually comes from the World Economic Forum, i.e. the people who fly in private jets to Davos and then claim that they're green. But let's not go there. Actually, no, let's go there, because I am UAL lead on climate emergency, and these things need to be noted. What the World Economic Forum does on an annual basis is what they call, again, it's worth looking at, risk interconnection map. And this is really interesting, because this is actually a group of economists understanding that actually the production of gizmos is not just what business is about. The production of gizmos is part of a much more complex set of social, environmental, political interactions. And if you look at these and the way that they change over the time, that what is happening is migration comes up right in the center. Rather worryingly, climate change and failure to mitigation is not quite as big as I would expect it to be, but I suspect in the 2020 version that is going to be central to the whole thing because of the threat to the financial systems that climate emergency places. So again, although these are kind of big global terms and they're big global issues, some of them will filter down even into an exercise that you are dealing with today. So what I'm saying is these kind of maps of interrelationships are a useful way of trying to understand these issues. I'm not going to call them problems, these issues that you're dealing with. And for example, one of the kind of seminal pieces on climate emergency or on the Anthropocene by Chakrabarty takes the word problem and says, this is not a problem because we cannot solve it. It's a predicament that we have to make sense of. The techno-boosters in climate emergency would be saying, it is a problem that can be solved. Spray sulfuric acid into the air and it's all going to be fine because it's going to reflect the sun. But if you only need to read Nair McCline or many other people on that, and you understand, actually, if you spray sulfuric acid, and that block, somewhere over here is a whole set of droughts happening in sub-Saharan Africa, and somewhere over there is a whole set of monsoons happening in the Indian subcontinent. So what I would suggest is that we don't talk about the problems of design, but we talk about the predicaments, or the fact that these issues are always interrelated. And the book, which I'm probably best known for, called Architecture Depends, I challenge this head on by talking about the problem of the problem. And the problem of the problem is really simple. The problem of the problem is that problems are set by experts in order that they can solve them. Therefore, it becomes a self-defining exercise. The problem of architecture is that you need a building. Well, maybe you don't. But let's say the problem of architecture is that you need a building and the solution is a building. Only an architect can provide that solution. Therefore, many of the problems that are set are self-defining and in that self-limiting. They don't take into account all these other, what I call in the book, contingencies, which affect the makeup of any context. So there's a nice quote here, which is, a professional is a man with an interest, a continuing interest in the existence of problems. It's a very 19th century thing. Professions were set up on that basis. You define the field of problems, you then circumscribe it with rules and regulations and codes, and only you, as a group of architects, as a group of doctors, as a group of lawyers, can do that. And of course, that is still happening. Is there really a problem in quality assurance within universities? Who knows? But there is a whole profession which says there is. And that profession, I see these two laughing, that profession might be self-defining and self-perpetuating. And in fact, in order to keep the thing going, the machine of quality assurance going, you add more problems into it, which only the quality assurers can solve. So I use instead this word sense-making from a planner called John Forrester, which is quite simple. Sense-making is not a matter of instrumental problem-solving. Instrumental being important there, i.e. that there is a sort of linear, rational, instrumental solution to everything. But rather than sense-making, and this is the important bit, which gets back to the values of this course, it is a matter of altering, respecting, acknowledging, and shaping people's lived worlds. So it shifts it out of a kind of Enlightenment, modernist framework of technical rationality and into a sense of the other, working with others. And with that, it brings with it a sense of the ethic, of the ethical. So, if you take that as I do say define the issue. Huh. There I am, full of contradictions. If you take that as a thing, then possibly you go through a set of things. And what I want to do right at the end of this is to do a really quick exercise, which I'm laying out here. So step one is define the issue. You have the issue already defined. You are working on an issue. You've got various different takes on it. Step 2 is to spatialize the issue, and I'll explain that. It all looks a bit bonkers at the moment, but trust me, at the end of 10 minutes, you'll be an expert. Spatialize the sense making, and then describe the space making. So that's the exercise I'm going to set you. But don't worry, I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes saying how you're going to get there. So I'm going to start with this quote by one of my intellectual heroes, Henri Lefebvre, who was a French Marxist sociologist stroke philosopher. And what he says, so now we're now in Architecture 101, okay? Yep. Well, Jeremy Till's version of Architecture 101. What Lefebvre is saying here is that any space is produced through social means. Any space is social. So in the case of this room, for example, in the technical rational model of the world, it would be described in terms of dimensions. It would be described in terms of the location of that being hanging down and the screen there. It would be described in the fact that the blinds aren't very good, so you can't see the screen very well, etc., etc. In a Lefebvrean sense, you describe it in relation to, let's take one example, power. So I could have, for example, stood behind a lectern here throughout the whole thing. That would have established my authority over the room. That is a spatial social condition. I choose to walk around, which you may say makes me even more powerful because you have to follow me. And therefore, actually, by walking around, I am gathering your attention. And in that, actually, my social position is still more powerful. You have chosen, for example, to arrange the room like this, which breaks down a kind of hierarchy of rows of things. It makes your setting more, let's say, democratic, more equal, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of ways by which you have to understand the relationship between spatial relationships and social relationships. So when I'm talking to my students and really doing Architecture 101, the very simple lesson that I do is that if I draw a line on a piece of paper, and then another line, and then another line, and then another line, the standard way by which that is thought about within architectural production is that what that is describing is the production of a set of walls. Yep. And then those walls will take on aesthetic and technical sense. So if I'm designing what's called an elevation, what a building looks like, and I draw a line on it, and that line has a set of windows, the way that I draw those will then take on, in the completed building, a set of aesthetic resonances. And that's normally how architecture is described, as an aesthetic, technical set of solutions to a problem. So what I say to my students is that when you draw a line on a piece of paper, yes, it will bring with it aesthetics and what the thing is made of, but the first thing that you need to think about is what social relationship does that set up? So if you draw a line of, if you draw a lecture hall and you draw a lectern on one side, what social relationship does that set up in relation to the power of the tutor over the students? So every single line becomes the anticipation of a social relationship. Which is why I say that. Not sure Winston Churchill did say this, but apparently he might have. Boris Johnson quotes it in his rather awful biography of Winston Churchill, just to keep it. So let me give a few examples of what I mean. This is a topical one, because tomorrow, in this space, our futures, well, at least those from the UK and the EU is going to be determined. This dimension between there and there is a dimension of 2 sword lengths plus a little bit in the middle. What does this say about politics in that chamber? That the space is designed to anticipate hostility, but to prevent actual death. What does that say about the way that tomorrow's whatever happens is going to play out in terms of confrontation, in terms of behavior, in terms of respect, in terms of humility, and so on and so forth? Now, this is a very dramatic example of how a spatial relationship describes a social relationship. In this case, a very adversarial, problematic set of political engagements. The fact that tomorrow is going to be probably the most heightened version of that, but you're going to see it. If you switch on BBC Parliament, or if you'd watched BBC Parliament in the previous debates, you would have seen exactly what this spatial relationship does to the political debate in terms of the cross-party nonsense. Let me give you another example, which is in Mali, in the Dogon country. Amazing, just the most extraordinary set of spaces. So on the edge of an escarpment, which then overlooks a savanna, are these Dogon villages. And each Dogon village has at the center of it a council chamber. And this is the council chamber. So this is the equivalent of the village parliament. And then you look at it, and then you get inside it, and you see that inside it, there's no hierarchy. But importantly, you can only sit in it. And therefore, your aggression is moderated physically, because you're sitting. There's no specific orientation of the way that you sit, that you can sit in any of these holes or lumps or whatever. And in that, I think almost immediately, you can see a different sensibility about how a discussion might happen. Yeah?
Are those inputs made by people sitting on them, or are they made for people to sit on?
Good question. Take the Winston Churchill quote and a bit of both, probably. Yeah? Or if you take another version, which is I could juxtapose with the House of Commons, which is a building by Enrique Miralles and Benedetta Tiabuli, which is the Scottish Parliament building. This is the most, of the Parliament buildings I've seen, the most beautiful space, not just in terms of its aesthetics, but in terms of what it might mean for democracy. In as much as the space is shared, there is no hierarchy to it, there's no symmetry to it, there's a conscious lack of orientation in terms of even these people are not centered. But there's much more to it than that. That the public gallery is actually part of the overall space, whereas in the House of Commons, it's separated. If everyone saw the Extinction Rebellion stripping off and putting their bums against the glass, you'll see the glass separates the public from the chamber. So what does that say? We are separated from our politicians by a piece of glass in a separate space. Whereas in Scotland, they are you as a part of the democratic network, as citizens, can share the same space as your politicians. What does that then do to the accountability of the politicians to the citizens? Just that little shift in terms of the spatial relationships set up in the Scottish Parliament versus the House of Commons, I think is really profound. Possibly that's why some of the more sensible political gestures have come out of that Parliament rather than the House of Commons. So if I chose to take one of them, knife crime. Knife crime in the House of Commons is a deeply divided issue. The Tories are going to say, law and order, we have to punish people more. The other side will say, it's all because of austerity cuts and whatever. This lot understand that knife crime is not about the actual moment of the crime, it's what has produced that. So what this lot have done is put in place youth counselling services, medical stuff, I mean just a whole set of stuff which in terms of what you're dealing with is quite relevant because, or in terms of those system maps, they understand the system and therefore they don't go for the ridiculous populist thing of law and order, lock these people up, but actually a much more subtle approach of understanding the forces. Now, I'm not going to make the claim that that intelligence comes directly out of this spatial relationship. I will make the claim that within the House of Commons, the adversarial nature of that space leads to an adversarial and binary mode of political thinking, right or wrong.
Jeremy,
Yeah.
Do the parties sit separately or do they?
They are arranged in blocks, but even the blocks are not that well defined. Yeah. And then there's another thing which I think is rather beautiful, that the last thing you see before going to the House of Commons is Winston Churchill standing over you saying, bloody get it right, do it like I did, yeah? Whereas this is the last staircase that a Scottish MEP will be taking, not MEPs, whatever they're called, SNP. You go up, and right at the top of the stairs, there's a window which looks out over Edinburgh. So the last thing that you see before going in is, rather than another politician to behave, is the domicile of your citizens. Just little things like that. So this is nice. This is a TUC. So this is the TUC building, Trade Union Council, Congress House within London. And what's nice about this one is that what this does is that normally in a conference hall, the big lights are on the stage, and that, therefore, as I've described, gives the stage authority and power and sets up a hierarchy. In this one, it's the delegates who are flooded with light. They are the enlightened ones. So again, it's a sort of spatial trick in as much as light is part of how one understands space. I'll go through that one. I'll go through that one. I mean, these are just illustrations of the relationship of space and power. These are very extreme. So this is Versailles and the king, and all of the things end up in his bedroom. This is one of my favorite maps ever, just to show how you can almost, by reading this map, you can understand the spatial tensions that might go on. So that this is a map of gangs in Los Angeles, and you just think, my God, what the hell is happening there? Yeah? And so on and so forth. So it's just a diagram of space which has implied within it a set of fairly toxic social relationships. This is an example, so here's where I'll be political. In the noughties, under the Labour government, the Department of Education had a very, very intelligent school design research unit in which they used both their knowledge but also the knowledge of a set of architects who bid to be part of it, and Sarah Wilsmith and my partner is one of them, to develop exemplar schools. And one of the things that they did is to use evidence, as you are using evidence. And one of the pieces of evidence is that there's a direct correlation between the width of the corridor and how much bullying in there is in the school. Yep. So that the wider the corridor, the less bullying. So this very, very straightforward spatial principle. And so under the Exemplar Schools project, schools were designed, and there were lots of other things about natural ventilation, about light, etc., etc. A set of very, very established principles came out. Of course, when this government came in, public provision of ideas is not seen to be good because the market solves everything. And so the design of schools was handed over to the market. The market doesn't like wide corridors because they're expensive. What happens? They reduce the width of the corridors. What happens? Bullying has gone up in every single school which is newly designed under the present system of procurement. So this is where space is also highly politically charged as well. I won't do that because I want you to get on to do some exercise. Pulpit, no pulpit. Pulpit, person raised up in a church as a symbol of halfway to heaven, as therefore a symbol of God. Nice Danish church, no pulpit. I am your pastor. You are my flock. I don't know why, I just put these things. These are just fantastic buildings. So you need to see fantastic buildings. So these are the stone-cut churches in Ethiopia, in Lalibela, in which these are cut into the ground to leave a solid lump, which is then carved out. It's a lot of work, this. So not everybody, only about 12 people can actually get into the church. So then what happens is that around the edge, people start to gather around the edge, but the more holy ones go, and it's the most amazing sight. They're kind of physically engaged with the building, and at the same time ululating, sort of singing out loud. So the whole building, this whole space becomes a kind of sacred space in which they're physically bonded to that space. And I'll end up with these more domestic examples. So the corridor is a 19th century invention. Before the corridor, in the bourgeois or even aristocratic house, you did have a passage, but the passage was for servants to serve the various rooms. What happens was what is called enfilade, things in a sequence, and so there's no privacy. And so the king in Versailles, the bedroom is actually part of an open suite, and he would lie in bed and receive his visitors and his diplomats or whatever. And so the sense of privacy is completely different. And what changes it is the invention, or whatever you want to call it, of the corridor. Because as soon as you have a corridor, then the rooms become private, set off, set apart. And this particularly comes in relation to Victorian morality, because in the previous version, there's a sort of sense of almost decadence that you're lying in bed with everything a bed may mean in the most public space, whereas that is against the principles of Victorian morality, so that you begin to separate it off. And then the other great invention of the Victorians is this. So this is to stop, this thing which is called the escutcheon, is to stop people staring through the keyhole into the bedroom. So that this thing about spatial relationships operates at the level of Versailles, of cities, down to the level of a small detail like that. And to understand how much the kind of societies are inscribed in their space and what happens, and it is a two-way relationship, to answer your question, which comes first. It is a two-way relationship. But within the Dogon, this is a Dogon community. This is the space for an extended family, which has a storehouse, which has it is very gender specific, which is problematic in a contemporary situation, but that is, so if you look at that as a spatial condition versus that as a spatial condition, and what does that mean to an atomized society? The classic American, Australian suburb, the atomization of a kind of society is then also seen very, very purely as a set of spatial configurations. Or within the Victorian house, in which the domain of the woman is suppressed and is pushed to the back, and the domain of the man is at the front. So gender relationships very clearly inscribed within the layout of the Victorian house. And I think that I'm running out of this time, so I'm actually going to jump these ones and go to the end, and we'll do the exercise. So what I want you to do in the last 20 minutes is this. You have already begun to do step 1, but you're not going to do everything in 20 minutes, so just take one particular issue that you want to deal with. So rather than going from there through your Trello account to there, I want you to take a little diversion up and across and then down in 20 minutes. So the first step is to spatialize the issue. So as a group, just sit and draw a diagram or a plan or tell stories about how the issues that you're confronting might play out within a spatial configuration. I mean, you could do it from your own knowledge. Does it play out as a set of domestic interventions, or does it play out as a city-scale map? Yep. So that will be a kind of a definition or a representation or visualization of the issue. So take an issue which has a bit of conflict in it, yeah? Then make sense of that. How would you then address that issue and make sense of it through redescribing the spatial relationships? Remembering that the spatial relationships also bring with them social relationships. And then out of that, magically, you're going to solve the whole problem. But it's not a problem, it's a predicament. Any questions?